Tonight on WRAL, an all-new 2-hour episode of Dateline featuring the Susan Smith case. 30 years ago, Smith claimed her 2 young sons were taken during a carjacking, initiating a nationwide manhunt. Her frantic calls for help turned out to be a lie, and she was convicted of killing them. Today's Craig Melvin is correspondent on this episode. He joins us now in New York about this. And Craig, you were growing up in South Carolina when these boys disappeared. You knew about the crime then. What have you learned, though, about this case that you didn't know before?
Jeff, it's good to see you again. First of all, you know, I was a teenager back then. I was one of the millions glued to the television, hoping, praying even back then that these 2 little boys would be found somewhere nearby. And as we know, that never happened. During the course of this 2-hour Dateline, we've been working on it for a couple of months now. I actually learned a lot about the case I didn't know. A lot of it from David Smith. David Smith, the ex-husband of Susan Smith, still lives in South Carolina. Before talking to David, I did not fully appreciate how Susan, she didn't just dupe America. She didn't just dupe the world back then. She had managed to convince everyone close to her for 9 days that what she was saying was true. And so he goes back to those days, but he also spends a fair amount of time talking about just how much this one event in his life has defined his life. He still has people who come up to him in the grocery store and they'll say, David, you know, I prayed for you. I prayed for those little boys. I still think about you. I still think about them. I'm so sorry for what happened. He talks about how hard it has always been to go on with his life. You know, he's nearly taken his life a few times. He talks about that despair. But he also talks about meeting someone new and starting a new life and having a daughter now. And I just, you know, David Smith in this 2-hour Dateline, I think people will connect with him in a way that you weren't really able to 30 years ago. You'll also learn a fair amount from these letters. Susan Smith has been writing letters with a Dateline producer of ours, a woman named Carol Gable. She's been writing with Carol for more than 20 years. In fact, we just got a letter from Susan Smith last week, and we'll reveal some of that tonight. I think people will still find some of her thinking eyebrow raising, if you will. I think, you know, this is one of those stories, Jeff, and there are not a lot left these days that people, even now in a society where we've become desensitized to so much, this is still one of those stories that just grabs you by the collar and tugs at your heartstrings all these years later.
Yeah, well, time certainly didn't heal the wound for David Smith. In fact, when she came up for parole and did not get release, he said he did not want to see her get out either. So that was kind of harsh, cutting words right there. But also with Susan Smith's, those letters, the mental depression, the severe illness that she was facing there, I think people will find some interest in that as well.
I do think it's also, you know, it's important to note, and we do this in a 2-hour Dateline. Susan Smith, you know, she was a victim of abuse that came out during the trial. And David and I talked about this. She has not been a model prisoner by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, she had an inappropriate relationship with 2 guards. She's gotten in trouble for having illegal drugs in prison as well. She is not a sympathetic character. But it was interesting to hear her attorney, David Bruck, make the case for why she should, in fact, at some point be paroled. David Bruck believes that. He explained why he believes that during the course of this 2-hour Dateline. But one of the things that David Smith said to me, and by the way, we should point out, you know, David Smith has not done a lot of interviews over the years, really wants to try and move on with some semblance of a normal life. The main reason he sat down with Dateline is because he wants to make sure that at no point during her natural life, Susan Smith gets out of prison. He is on a one-man crusade to make sure that doesn't happen. That was his primary motivation. In addition to remembering Michael and Alex, he wants to make sure that Susan Smith isn't able to rewrite history and somehow convince a large swath of the parole board that she has in fact been rehabilitated and deserves to see the light of day.
Well, you lay out a lot of reasons there why this gripped the nation 30 years ago and why it is still captivating now. Craig, I want to thank you. Dateline's all-new 2-hour episode, Return to the Lake, airs tonight at 9 right here on WRAL.